Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I serve on the MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people with MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. MS occurs most commonly in adults. Joining me to talk about how MS can affect adolescents and how to manage MS as a family is Dr. Ann Ye. Dr. Ye is a professor of pediatric neurology at the University of Toronto and the director of the MS and Neuroinflammatory Disorders Program and Fellowship Program at the University of Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, known as Sick Kids. Dr. Ye is also a senior scientist and co-director of clinical trials at the Sick Kids Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. Ye. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, how common is MS in adolescents, and what are the early signs and symptoms to look for?
Well, it's uncommon in adolescence. We know that neuroinflammation or demyelination in children occurs in about 1 in 100,000 kids. But if you think about it in terms of MS as a whole, it occurs in about 10% of people who eventually have the diagnosis of MS.
Teenagers experience significant mental, emotional, and physical growth during adolescence. So, how does MS affect their development in these important areas?
That's such an important question, John, and I appreciate your asking that. Getting a diagnosis of chronic illness, of course, is a big deal for teenagers and for anyone that that receives the diagnosis. And so it's not surprising to know that that depression and fatigue are common in kids with MS in the same way that it's common in the adult population. We found that about a third of kids have symptoms of depression, and that even more experience symptoms of fatigue. In terms of development, we know that depression and fatigue increase through time, and that can affect interactions with peers and other social development, potentially. But as well, what we know about MS in terms of the physical is that while kids with MS don't actually have a lot of motor disability. Some people think about MS and think immediately about motor disability. There's not a whole lot of motor disability, but there is worry about learning and cognition that occurs. And there are people who have studied this around the world that have found that that there is a greater effect on cognition in people who have pediatric onset MS than on adult onset MS. It's a super important thing to think about.
What treatments are available for adolescents with MS, and are they different from those treatments that are available for adults?
Yeah, so this is also a really important question because what we all need to recognize, or we all do recognize in the MS field now, is that the disease MS is the same thing in adults and in children, especially in the adolescent period. And because of that, all MS therapies, disease-modifying therapies, are being used around the world for kids with MS. On the other hand, the number that are approved by the FDA is much smaller in number because it's incredibly difficult to meet the high bar that the FDA requires for approval. So there are two sides to that. There are only a small number of therapies, actually only one therapy that's been approved in the US for use with children, but all of the therapies are being used and many are being studied in trials.
Are there any specific healthy habits that adolescents with MS should focus on to help manage their symptoms?
Yeah, there are a number of healthy habits that could make a big difference to kids and adolescents with MS. We have been very interested in physical activity and exercise for quite some time, and literature in the adult MS population and in other children with chronic illnesses, and our own work looking at kids with MS has pointed to marked benefits of physical activity. Exercise being that stuff that makes your heart beat hard, makes you sweat, is a particular benefit. And there have been studies that have shown neuroprotective effects, remyelinating effects, and effects on things that we just talked about, depression, fatigue, and those types of things.
I'm going to circle back to that physical activity in just a couple of moments, but and you've actually started to answer my next question already. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about mental health concerns that adolescents with MS might face.
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that we see a lot in our clinical population. It's one of those hidden things because, people often think about the teenage years as a difficult time anyway, a time when emotions go up and down in any child. What we've found is that depression, and I think I mentioned this earlier, depression is actually higher in our population than in the other teenagers that we deal with and teenagers that don't have MS. So depression and mental health concerns are a big issue for the kids that we take care of.
Since you mentioned physical activity, I think we should talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
What types of physical activity might be recommended for adolescents with MS, especially activities that can help with depression and anxiety?
Yeah. So what I like to say is that any physical activity is good. So people in general know about the benefits of exercise. It's written about in the newspapers all the time, and there's so many different benefits of exercise, but it can be a scary thing for people. So people that haven't been doing a lot of activity, and kids as well, may not have that self-confidence to go out and say, run 5 miles on the day that someone makes a recommendation. So if I, as a doctor, have someone visit me in clinic and say, well, what should I do? And if I said something like, oh, you got to exercise, why don't you start running 5 miles a day? That's a recipe for not having success, right? And so my recommendation is really to get up and move, find ways to move, find ways to walk someplace rather than taking transit. Use active transit as a start, because in reality, when experimental models have been done to look at where we might find benefits, most of the large benefit is when you get your heart rate up, when you're doing that vigorous activity. But the way to get there is to condition yourself to like it, first of all, enjoy yourself, and to start with baby steps.
Physical activity and nutrition often go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
How does obesity affect adolescents with MS, and how can good nutrition help manage their symptoms?
Yeah. So, this is a very, I would say an important topic, and one that is there's not enough knowledge about. So there have been some studies that have looked at associations between obesity and the outcome of MS, whether or not you actually get a diagnosis of MS. They've suggested that that higher body mass index associates with a higher likelihood of getting MS. But the challenge is when you look at nutrition studies, it's very hard to know what the elements are, because you can have a high BMI, but have a lot of activity and actually be quite healthy. So what I like to talk about, and I think it's a very challenging conversation to have, around weight, because I think in many ways, when you focus too much on weight, people develop poor habits like starvation and things that may be not so good for mental health. So what I think the important thing to focus on is healthy foods and being active, and also increasing your self-efficacy for getting out there and moving. Studies that have looked at foods have looked at things like, vegetable content and saturated fat content, and they suggest more vegetables and less saturated fat could be important, but these are, again, very, very hard things to study.
Well, we know physical activity is important. Let's talk about what might get in the way. What are some of the common barriers that adolescents with MS face in participating in physical activity?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, one of the biggest barriers is having someone to, having MS means that you're not going to have friends or things like that. But we found that having a network of kids or network of friends that is getting out there doing things is conducive to actually increasing activity. So I think a barrier for any child is that, having people around, or the lack of people around to do things with. But the other thing that we've been looking at recently is whether or not where you live, meaning whether you've got green space around you, whether there's a lot of traffic around you, some of those environmental things that could make a difference. And what we found is that if you have more, it kind of makes sense, but it's really just to emphasize the point. If you've got more green space around you, if you have access to facilities, you're more likely to use them. So access to green space is really important. And then, and the other thing is access to not necessarily programming, but if you live in a place where, say, it's not safe outside, and you don't have green space, if there were access to places to go where you could be physically active, that's something that could increase your activity.
As we were talking, we heard from Sandra. Sandra tells us that her teenage daughter spends a lot of time on her phone, therefore doesn't have time for much exercise.
Yes.
What strategies have been shown to support teenagers and their families in becoming more active?
Yeah, so this is really important. We've got so many things to do now that we have phones. We get to our phones have sort of taken over our lives in terms of scrolling and needing to know the next piece of news. So what we've done in our program is we've developed an app that we're testing right now, which creates a sort of a motivational setting. It's a theory-based app, which connects kids with coaches. It provides educational modules about physical activity and exercise, and it actually provides some examples of things that could be fun to do to increase activity. So that's one way of increasing activity, using a remote thing. We've got phones anyway, and kids like to use phones. To increase activity through something that maybe kids are are interested in any way. That particular app is used with a activity tracker that's wrist-based. We think that it's appealing. The kids that have used it have found it to be appealing.
Very often, a teen who's living with MS doesn't know any other teens who are living with MS.
Mhm.
How important is it for young people with MS and their families to connect with others who are in similar situations? And how do they find that support?
Yeah, so that's such an important question. You're asking such great questions today. Um, so often it depends on the teen. Some teens take a little time and would rather, um, uh, talk to people that don't have the same diagnosis. But a lot of families we know and a lot of kids we know actually do want to meet other people. And it is, you're absolutely right. It's very, very challenging. And the reasons are that when something, it's relatively rare and people may not know someone else in their neighborhood that lives near them. We have teen nights that help kids connect with each other. The National MS Society has all kinds of ways of teens connecting with one another and being able to ask questions. And so those are two avenues for people to get to meet other people. I would encourage anyone with MS to look up the local MS Society, whether it's the National MS Society in the US and Canada. I'm in Canada. In Canada, it's MS Canada, to find out which links there are, because the kids that I take care of really find these things to be incredibly beneficial and to provide social support.
You recently co-authored research on the benefits of physical activity for depression and fatigue in multiple sclerosis. Can you tell us about your research and why it's important to understand that relationship between physical activity, fatigue, and depression in adolescents with MS?
Yeah, we have a number of papers that have looked at those relationships. And what we found is that that it only takes a little bit of extra physical activity to reduce levels of fatigue and depression, or to associate with lower levels of fatigue and depression in the kids that we take care of. So what we found was that one bout, we used questionnaires, which ask kids how many bouts of physical activity, 15-minute bouts of physical activity they did per week. And it turned out that really it just took one extra bout of physical activity to move the needle 1 point on the fatigue or depression scale. That's, it may not seem to be that much to us. It's a big deal if you're not doing a whole lot, but it's not giant, like having to go for 2 hours to move the needle. It's really just a small amount that will increase, we think will increase mood and improve fatigue.
In your research, you talk about pediatric onset multiple sclerosis and monophasic acquired demyelinating syndromes, or monADS. Can you
Mhm.
explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for asking that question. So, children with monophasic demyelinating syndromes, or we call them monADS, are kids who have one event of neuroinflammation, and it usually occurs at quite a young age. They might have something like inflammation of the optic nerve, or they might have an episode of inflammation of the brain or of the spinal cord, but it goes away, and it never comes back. So that's the word. That's why it's the monophasic. And acquired demyelinating syndromes means that it's not a genetic or other syndrome. So that's monophasic demyelinating syndromes. And what happens to most of the kids that have monophasic events is that they have their event, and then they go on to not have further events, and are very close to healthy children in that they don't seem to have the same depression, fatigue, and other symptoms that we have found in MS.
What might account for the higher rate of depressive symptoms in youth with pediatric onset MS compared to those with monADS?
You know, a lot of people have asked the question of whether this has something to do with the actual with MS itself, both in the adult and pediatric populations. So there's a possibility it is related to the disease itself. And the second possibility is that it's related to the life situation of having a chronic illness. There may be accompanying anxiety that comes with receiving a diagnosis, a serious diagnosis. Sometimes it relates to being reminded of the diagnosis and the disease by taking a medication frequently, or being worried that one is going to have another neurologic event in the future. So there are many reasons why the rates are higher in the pediatric population. I think we need to learn more about that in the future.
Your research has really shed some great light on adolescents who are living with MS and how they might best be treated. How can healthcare providers use that research when they're treating adolescents with MS or other demyelinating conditions?
Yeah, I think if we if we want to think about the kinds of things that that we've looked at in terms of physical activity, I think the first thing to do, because I will say that most families that come to us in clinic have as the first question, is there something that we can do to change things? And so the first thing I would say is offer a supportive hand, take away any sense of blame or guilt that families have. And then second, try to offer some simple and achievable goals with regards to the everyday activities that people can do, and to provide support and social support to the kids that are trying to start up these physical activity, and to changing their everyday habits in terms of diet, to provide the environment that is conducive to a positive outcome, meaning baby steps, being supportive, doing the same thing, changing one's own habits to demonstrate support and to set an example. Those are the simple things I think people can do.
Well, you shared a lot of great information and some important insights about adolescents who are living with MS. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember and to use?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say number 1 would be remember about the symptoms that associate with MS, such as depression and fatigue, and the other problems such as cognitive issues that very frequently will accompany adolescents in MS. The second is that there is a way to make a difference, and there is a way to do this in a supportive way. So we feel that physical activity makes a huge difference to the kids we're taking care of. So encourage physical activity. And number 3 would be provide the support and think about the things that can help improve those physical activity practices rather than just prescribing it.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some great questions, and thank you, Dr. Ye, for being with us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate your asking such great questions and including me in this program.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigators are your best partners when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll hear about ways that you can get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Ye for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MS-expert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming programming topics on the National MS Society's website. Now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. And on Twitch, you can find that link in the chat. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Ann Ye and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.